The focus of this news isn't just the opening of Hormuz. The focus is something else, and it's more serious. The Iranian regime has entered an open power struggle, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard advancing on the heart of power, while the United States Navy keeps direct pressure on the most sensitive point of the crisis. Why does this matter so much? Because regimes like this survive on three pillars: fear, command, and the appearance of unity. If the Islamic Revolutionary Guard grows amid the crisis, it's because it feels that the civilian establishment has failed. If the foreign minister is forced to signal that Hormuz was open while the hardliners react with fury, it's because the rift has already come out from behind the scenes. On this April 18, 2026, what appears before the world is a fractured Islamic regime, pressured from the outside and trampled from within. The main question is no longer just whether Iran will negotiate. The question now is, who is really in charge? What happened in practice was a sequence that exposed this chaos. On Friday, April 17th, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the passage of commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz was open. However, at the same time, the United States maintained the blockade and the maritime warnings about real risk in the region. In other words, the Iranian government spoke about opening, but the force that continued to set the tone for maritime security was the American one. This triggered a shock within the Iranian system itself, because the gesture was interpreted by hardline sectors of the regime as retreat, weakness, and concession in the midst of war. This is the crux of it. The ones who appear at the center of the crisis are not just the foreign minister or the Iranian president. The one who gains prominence is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Reuters reported back in March that the Guard took on an even more central role in war decisions, hardening the regime's stance and expanding its influence over internal security, military strategy, and political leadership. Days later, Reuters itself showed that the divisions between radical factions and more pragmatic sectors became more visible within the Iranian leadership. In simple terms, the regime stopped acting as a closed bloc, and when the Guard starts to have more power than the civilian establishment, the situation starts to look like an internal coup. Who are the central figures in this upheaval? On one side, Abbas Araghchi, who became the public face of the attempt to ease tensions in Hormuz. On the other side, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which represents the hardest, most heavily armed faction and the one most willing to turn external war into total control within Iran. Amid all this, the United States, with Trump increasing political pressure and the US Navy maintaining a military presence and blockade in the region, the result is devastating for the regime. The diplomatic sector says one thing, the military wing reacts differently, and the whole world starts to see the disorder that was previously hidden behind the scenes. Where does this chaos become most visible? On three fronts. First, in Tehran, where the struggle for authority was exposed. Second, in Hormuz, because the strait became proof that the regime can no longer use its main threat without facing an immediate reaction. Third, in the negotiations mediated by Pakistan, which remain tense with no agreement reached and deep disagreements over the nuclear program. When a regime comes to the negotiating table without internal unity, it doesn't negotiate from a position of strength, it negotiates under pressure, and that's what's happening now. How does the United States Navy plunge the Islamic regime into chaos? It's not just through ships or blockades. It's because the American naval pressure disrupts Iran's room for maneuver at the exact point where the regime most likes to project power. Hormuz has always been used by Tehran as a political, economic, and psychological weapon, but now the route has been partially reopened under pressure. Ships have resumed testing the crossing, and even so, the risk remains so high that international shipping kept seeking security guarantees. This undermines the image of absolute control that the regime was trying to sell. And when that image falls apart, the internal dispute gets worse, because each faction starts looking for someone to blame for the setback. Why does this matter so much? Because regimes like this survive on three pillars: fear, control, and the appearance of unity. If the Islamic Revolutionary Guard grows in the midst of the crisis, it's because they feel the civilian establishment has failed. If the foreign minister is forced to signal that Hormuz would open while the hardliners react with fury, it's because the rift has already come out from behind the scenes. And if the United States maintains military and diplomatic pressure at the same time, the result is this suffocating environment where the regime speaks with different voices, sends contradictory signals, and loses cohesion at the most dangerous moment. Chaos doesn't start when everything completely falls apart. Chaos starts when control becomes contested. In the end, Iran is not just experiencing an external crisis, it is going through an internal struggle over the regime's direction.